Welcome back to Crime Pod. On June the 26th, 1895, he started out with photographs of Holmes and the three children. He proceeded to Cincinnati and began visiting the hotels. When he reached the Hotel Bristol at 6th and Vine Streets, the clerk identified the pictures as those of a man and three children who registered under the name of Cook. It was the detective's theory that Holmes had murdered the children in some house in the suburbs of some city, so he began to make rounds of the real estate offices, both in the city and in the suburbs. When he arrived at the office of J.C. Thomas at 15 East 3rd Street, the clerk recognised the picture of Holmes and Howard Petizel, and it was learned that Holmes had rented a house at 305 Poplar Street, where he only remained 2 days. Gaia proceeded there and interviewed a Miss Hill who resided next door. She saw Holmes moving an immense stove into the house, but no furniture. The singular incident so impressed her that she unconsciously watched the proceeding very closely. Holmes observed this and decided to change his plans, but before leaving the house with Howard, he offered the stove to the inquisitive lady. Gaia then proceeded to Indianapolis and visited the hotels and real estate offices. He gathered valuable information as to the route taken by the children from their letters, which they wrote to their mother, but which Holmes withheld and foolishly kept in his possession. Here Mr. Herman Mudgett was located, and he at once identified the pictures of the children as those of guests who stopped with him when he conducted the Circle House. He also stated that the children were held in their room practically as prisoners, and although they were constantly crying, they refused to state the cause of their grief. In a letter written by Alice to her mother just before they left Indianapolis, and which was found in Holmes's pocket when arrested, the girl innocently remarked that Howard, meaning her brother, is not with us now. This convinced Gaia that the child had been murdered in or near Indianapolis, but he failed to obtain any clue at that time upon which to work. The detective then proceeded to Holmes Castle in Chicago, but he learned nothing there regarding the Petizel children. He then proceeded to Detroit and found that on October the 12th, Nellie and Alice Petizel were registered at the New Western Hotel, but neither Howard nor the trunk were seen there. Thinking that Holmes might have had Howard and the trunk with him, Gaia proceeded to learn where Holmes stopped and found that he and Miss Yoke were registered as G. Howell and wife at the Hotel Normandy. But as neither the boy nor the trunk were seen at this place, the detective became more convinced than ever as to where little Howard met his fate. But intent on tracing the girls first, Gaia proceeded to Toronto, Canada, where Mrs. Petizel next met Holmes. He arrived on Monday, July the 8th, and found that Holmes and Miss Yoke registered on October the 18th, 1894, at the Walker House under the name of Howell and wife, and that the children were registered at the Albion Hotel under the name of Canning. Herbert Jones, the chief clerk of this hotel, stated on October the 25th, Holmes called for the children, paid their bill, and they were never seen again. As it was known that Holmes went to his first wife in Gilmantown a few days after this, Gaia became convinced that the fiend had rented a house in Toronto for the purpose of murdering the two girls. He prepared a list of all real estate agents and had the newspapers publish the pictures of the children and print his theories. He then began a canvass of the real estate offices, which lasted for days, but nothing was accomplished. Finally, Gaia learned that a Mrs. Frank Nudell had rented a house at number 16 Vincent Street in October 1894 to a man who only remained there a few days and acted quite mysteriously. He immediately proceeded to the house, but when he reached the house, located at number 18 Vincent Street, he showed the pictures of Holmes and Alice to Mr. Thomas Rives, who resided there, and that gentleman instantly recognised them as the photographs of a man and girl who were at the house next door for a day and then disappeared. Mr. Rives furthermore stated that this man borrowed a spade from him, saying he wanted to plant some potatoes. On receiving this information, Gaia hurried to the home of Mrs. Nudell, and when he showed the lady and her daughter Holmes's picture and asked them if they'd ever seen the man, they instantly replied that it was the picture of the man who rented their Vincent Street property. Gaia's enthusiasm now knew no bounds. He rushed back to number 18 Vincent Street and, borrowing the same shovel Holmes had used, proceeded to the next house, number 16, where a family named Armbrust was then living. After hurriedly making known his mission, the lady told him to proceed with his investigation. He examined the house, and on raising the linoleum in the kitchen, he discovered a trapdoor which led to a dark cellar. He procured a light, and after examining the ground, he found a spot which appeared to have been recently disturbed. He'd only been digging a minute or two when a terrible odour arose, which became more horrible with each shovelful of dirt removed. He finally unearthed what was apparently the arm of a child, but as the flesh fell from the bones, he decided that great caution would be necessary or the bodies would fall to pieces. So Undertaker Humphreys was called in, and the digging proceeded, with the result that the terribly decomposed bodies of Nellie and Alice Petizel were found. While the features of the children could not be recognised, the clothing and hair were readily identified by the heartbroken mother, who started for Toronto as soon as she was advised of the discovery. To make assurance doubly sure, Gaia located a family named MacDonald, who moved into the house after Holmes left, and they found a wooden egg from which, when parted in the middle, a little snake would spring out. Mrs. Petizel recognised this toy, as she had purchased it for her little girls. These bodies were entirely nude when found, and the clothing was taken from the dead children by Holmes and stuffed up the chimney in the parlour with some straw and set on fire. But as they did not burn, the chimney was left in a clogged condition, and Mrs. Armbrust, on examining it, found the clothes and fortunately did not dispose of them. It is perhaps needless to say that Holmes' object in removing and destroying the clothes was to prevent these bodies from being identified. On July the 19th, after the burial of the Petizel children in Toronto, Gaia proceeded to Detroit, where he learned that Holmes had rented a house at 241 East Forest Avenue, and an investigation showed that he had dug a grave in the cellar, but before he had an opportunity to complete his work, information reached him that detectives were on his trail, and he abandoned his plans for the time being. Gaia left Detroit on July the 23rd and returned to Indianapolis to search for little Howard Petizel's body. For days and days he made a tireless round of the real estate offices, both in the city and for miles out into the suburbs. On August the 1st he went to Chicago, as a child's skeleton had been found at Holmes Castle, but Gaia became convinced that this was the remains of some other unfortunate child, and in a few days he returned to Indianapolis. The search now included all the small towns within a radius of several miles from the city. After nearly a month's work, no place remained unsearched but the pretty little town of Irvington, about 6 miles from Indianapolis. In this town, Mr. Gaia, who was now almost exhausted, wearily made his way to the real estate office of an elderly man named Brown. After relating his story and showing his pictures hundreds of times, after weeks of fruitless labour and nights of restless sleep, Gaia again related his story and showed his pictures of Holmes. The old man adjusted his glasses and finally remarked that it was the picture of a man who rented a house from him in October 1894. As the house belonged to a Dr. Thompson, who had seen the tenant, Gaia, who had now taken a new lease of life, hurried to him, and the doctor not only identified the picture as a likeness of his tenant, but told the detective that a boy in his employ, named Elvit Moorman, had seen this man with a boy at the house. When interviewed, Elvit immediately identified the pictures of Holmes and little Howard. He stated that his duty compelled him to go and milk a cow every afternoon, which was kept in a lot in the rear of the house Holmes rented, and that while so engaged, Holmes asked him to help him put up a stove when he had finished milking. The boy complied with the request, and while assisting Holmes, he asked him why he did not use a gas stove instead of a coal stove, and Holmes replied that gas was not healthy for children. Little Howard was present when his remark was made. Gaia then proceeded to the vacant cottage, which was across the street from a Methodist church. He searched the house from cellar to roof and discovered nothing. He then looked through the lattice work between the piazza floor and the ground and saw some pieces of an old trunk. He broke in after this and found that in one place on the remains of the trunk a piece of blue calico had been pasted, and on this calico was the figure of a flower. As the earth appeared to have been disturbed, Gaia began digging with a vengeance, but all in vain. He then proceeded to the barn and there found an immense coal stove. As it was growing late, Gaia quit for the night with the intention of resuming the search in the morning. Mrs. Petizel was then with her folks in Galva, Illinois, and Gaia telegraphed this query: "Did missing trunk have blue calico with white flower over seam on bottom?" And the answer was yes. When Gaia left the cottage, two boys named Walter Jenny and Oscar Kettenbach, who knew of Gaia's mission, decided to play detective. They began looking for evidence in the cottage and ran their busy hands into a stovepipe hole in the chimney in the basement. They brought out a handful of ashes, but in those ashes were several teeth and small pieces of bone. While Gaia was still in the telegraph office at Irvington, he was informed of this discovery and rushed back to the cottage. Procuring a hammer and chisel, he tore down the lower part of the chimney and found almost a full set of child's teeth, several pieces of human bone, and a large charred mess which proved to be a portion of a child's stomach, liver, and spleen, baked hard. The corner grocer then came forward and announced that the boy whose picture Gaia showed him came to his store in October and left his coat there, saying that he would call for it, but he never returned. Mrs. Petizel was again sent for, and she identified the coat as belonging to little Howard.